The university classroom is seen as a space for a free and open exchange of ideas. But the fear of offending someone plays in that classroom as well. Joining us now to tell us what he sees from his students, Ian Williams, English professor and the 2014-15 Canadian Writer-in-Residence at the University of Calgary. And Ian, it's good to have you back here at TVO.
Thank you.
Let's just, a little background here. Tell us about what you teach.
Well, I teach both literature and creative writing, and I also teach composition like most faculty members do. There's a kind of intellectual drive of let's discuss these poems, let's discuss these stories, novels.
Which
and
writers?
Also mostly American, and I do poetry from the beginning to the present, right? So I cover all periods of poetry and American literature, 20th century, best with sort of 1950s, 1960s writers. And also creative writing. So I think the concerns are both kind of intellectual and expressive. They have two different strands.
How long have you been teaching?
This is my 10-year anniversary, actually, right?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Happy anniversary. Well, in terms of political correctness, we really want to get a better understanding of the changes that you have seen since you started 10 years ago to today. So what are you seeing?
Well, I don't have a 40-year career, right? So 10 years is not 40 years. And I've taught both in America and Canada. So
where'd you teach in the States?
Massachusetts, Central Mass, at a state school, which is different because you've got the big Ivies. You've got Harvard and MIT and BU just an hour east of where I was. And then we've got these state schools that cater to a different population. So there is a kind of fear. There's a kind of nervousness, I think, if not an outright fear. And it mostly comes out of this sense of, I think, not being historically comfortable. So not wanting to engage difficult issues because they're not quite sure of the history, not quite sure where they fit and how to position themselves in relation to especially in America, right, these upsetting racial histories.
See, back in my day, you were afraid, but for different reasons. You were afraid of looking stupid in front of other people.
Well, that never goes away.
That never goes away. Okay, but this is a different fear that you're expressing.
Right. I think there's this weight of the past and this kind of complicated history that students can't quite figure out how to enter. And so there's a lot of noise, a lot of information. And they really, at heart, want to do the right thing. They believe themselves good people. So it's not stupidity, right? And it's not some defect in their moral character. They want to do the right thing. They just don't quite know how to start and how to have those conversations. So if we are talking about race in the classroom, let's say I'm teaching 20th century African American lit, and we encounter a text that might have sort of a fractured black family or a difficult interracial relationship. And I ask a student a personal question.
What gender and or ethnicity of student?
Well, it's funny, right? Because in these African American lit classes in Massachusetts, they'd be mostly white in those, and there might be one or two black students in there, and that matters. There's a black body in front of white bodies. So if I ask a personal question, such as, would you pursue a relationship with someone of another race? There'd be a kind of silence at first, because we're not supposed to talk personal things in the classroom, right? We're supposed to talk ideas and keep it up there. And I take a very different approach. So if I ask that, there'd be the stunned silence at first, and then, yeah, that expression, the kind of yeah, because that's the correct thing to say, right?
The politically correct thing to say.
Politically correct thing to say. I am open-minded, of course I wouldn't discriminate. If I ask, what would your friends think about that? They'd be okay, like, that's not an issue. And then if I push that a third level and I say something, and what would your parents say?
That's the bridge too far.
Yeah. At that point, more silence, and maybe one bold student might say something like, my mom will be okay with that. She would be okay with that. My dad, he's not a racist, though, right? He might have some kind of issue with it, but he's not a racist. And before the explanation comes this kind of defense of the father's position. And I'm there not to accuse the father of being a racist, not to accuse them of being a racist, but to be aware of how subtle these things are, and how you can carry these kinds of biases and agendas without even being aware of it, carry this baggage. And so just to get students to recognize that, no, I don't, my dad's a great person. He still has some ideas that aren't politically correct, but I kind of understand where he's coming from. right?
Because he was born in a different time, in a different place. And
That's right.
Yada, yada, yada.
Right, right. And to voice those in the classroom and not be afraid of censorship and not be afraid that their peers are going to call them out as being sort of from a racist
Well,
lineage.
that was my next question. So, okay, fear of that, but then also a fear of being called out as a racist by other students in the
Right.
class. Do you see that?
Well, I think maybe in grad school it gets a little bit worse, right? Because you've got the artillery of language to attack folks with. As undergrad students, I think the censorship comes from within, and it's strange that they've actually learned to police themselves so young, so that they may never make a comment like that, because the big brother in their head, that internalized force, is already saying that's not a right thing to say.
Self-censorship then?
Yeah, self-censorship.
And what
as
do you,
undergrad
as
students.
a prof who's supposed to be involved in free speech and opening up the mind, think about that?
I disclose, right? And by sort of leading by example in that case, I say things like, my grandmother was uncomfortable having lunch with a white family that came to visit us because she wasn't used to sitting at a table with white folks. This is a different generation altogether, right? If I disclose and say something about the pervasiveness of race in my experience there, and then someone else might chime in and say, well, my grandmother, and then eventually we get closer to me, right?
You open it up.
Right.
You give them permission.
Right, right. Just by saying these things about me, no one's really immune to these discussions of race or sexuality or gender. And in creative writing, it becomes even more problematic, right? Because suddenly you can't write a story as a black character if you're a white man, or an Asian woman if you're a black guy.
Do you mark all the papers?
I do.
Okay. I ask because, again, recalling back my own post-secondary experience, you knew what the professor thought, but then there were usually teaching assistants who were far more ideological and had, definitive positions and were coming from a certain place, and you always worried that if they marked the papers, you were in certain, you want to talk about self-censoring or policing what you write.
Right.
So I wonder whether or not your students are in fact being policed about what they write.
That's interesting. I'd like to think of myself as a pretty sensitive responder to their papers. And I'm not interested in sort of tying them up in playing moral games and tying them up in sort of ethical. I'm not grading their ethics, right? There is some of that. They want to argue the right thing. They want to say the right thing, and they're trying to figure out what I think the right thing is to say. I'm far less interested in that, and they get that sense early on, but still, it's a hard thing to break, right? This idea that say what pleases the professor in order to get ahead. But eventually, if they don't put it in writing, they might start to voice these things little by little throughout the semester, right? So the victory is not in terms of they're not going to publish these essays, right, about their positions.
But I think there's a difference between saying, oh, my professor really follows Jeremy Bentham, therefore I better say something nice about Bentham when I do my philosophy paper,
Right.
versus, oh boy, my professor's black, I better not say anything offensive that will tick him off on that scale.
Right. That's really interesting, yeah, and I think there's some truth there. My first day in Massachusetts, when I was teaching African American literature, I stood up in front of the class and said, I'm teaching this course, but I am not African American. And my students looked at me and they were baffled by that, right? Because here's a black man, and it seemed like I had a Michael Jackson complex or something, right? And I had
telling them, don't think of my color.
Well, not quite. I was telling them something more specific. I was telling them that there are other brands of blackness apart from African American, right? That I'm Afro-Canadian, and there are other kinds of species of blacks throughout the world, and West Indian blacks and British blacks. And so to think that the American black has the monopoly on race is something that we need to explode right away from the beginning.
What kind of feedback do you get on that?
Surprise, first of all, and there was like, yeah, but I even call Africans African American, right? They call everybody African American regardless of her origin. So to open that up, first of all, and then they see that there's no quite pleasing or trying to figure this man out, right? He's not interested in his own subject, invalidating his own position there. So,
How hard is it for you to find the balance between wanting to encourage a good interchange of ideas, the freedom for a student to think what he or she wants, to write what he or she wants, while at the same time providing this so-called, what everybody calls now, safe space in the classroom that some students sort of feel entitled not to be offended by offensive or controversial ideas? How do you handle all that?
huge. That's a huge question, right? This idea of safe space that typically means physically safe space. No school wants to end up as the next sort of poster school of school shooters, right? But eventually that sort of crept over and started becoming intellectually safe spaces and emotionally safe spaces. And I don't want to sort of minimize the reality of trauma and hurt and people who've gone through negative experiences. So there's legitimacy to having these safe emotional spaces. But when these spaces start to be co-opted by people who don't have trauma and don't come out of sort of negative backgrounds in order to have a platform to stand on. So, I mean, the victim position and the traumatic sort of survivor position is sometimes assumed by students as a kind of badge of identity, right? How do you call someone and say,
you're not entitled to that?
Right, that your problem that you're voicing right now is really, it's a first world problem and it doesn't really have teeth. I don't need to call that out, but I have to have them see it and recognize it themselves, right? So the system of sort of Socratic questioning until they get to that point where they say, well, I guess I don't have a point here, or maybe my point has changed. And to also feel free to change the mind, right? You don't have to commit to this position indefinitely. You might be here right now and you might say something offensive, but later on, you can change your mind.
You're an English prof, so you no doubt heard of this guy named Kafka.
Sure.
Here's what he wrote. I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. We need books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. This is my belief. What do you think about that?
Oh, that's powerful. And not just books. Yes, great art can do this to us, but also classrooms and universities should be doing this to us as well, right? So you get into a classroom and this axe sort of lodges in you so that you come out different and better and deeper and richer afterwards.
Okay, but Ian, this is a call to arms. I don't have to tell you. And the criticism I hear nowadays too often is that classrooms are no longer a place where it's a call to arms. Offend me, grieve me, stab me. There are places where teachers are afraid to push their students.
Absolutely.
For a whole variety of reasons, and where students, for the reasons you said, feel inhibited about really engaging in free speech. Who's served if that's the case?
Well, no one. I mean, I almost want to ascribe blame in a case like this, but that's probably pointless. But I guess when the shift has become so that students are customers and clients and things like that, that shift towards a kind of corporate model where students feel the entitlement of the dollar, right, and tuition dollars paying for their experience. When that occurs, then these kinds of experiences are not what they signed up to buy, right? They sign up to have great college experiences as the movies show. So this becomes a problem, and then professors will live in fear as a result of that. But I think it still behooves us, regardless of the repercussions, to push back on that, to honestly sort of wield that axe going into the classroom. And it's not, maybe an axe is too strong, right? But to wield some kind of surgical tool that will cut them open and heal them and repair them.
That doesn't sound like a safe space, Ian, and a lot of students today want that safe space.
And administrators too,
and
right?
Administrators, for sure.
The pressure's coming from both directions and we're caught in the middle.
And the fundraisers for the universities, they want those safe spaces.
Yeah, but I don't believe in that kind of safe space that's sanitized and neutralizes intellectual pursuit. And I think there needs to be a difference between spaces that are unsafe and spaces that are uncomfortable. Right? So it's plenty good, and I encourage these uncomfortable situations where we talk race, gender, sexuality in class, and you leave class saying I was really disturbed, versus those experiences that are unsafe, that you're damaged afterwards.
Unsafe versus uncomfortable is a great way of defining the difference. That's terrific. Congratulations, first of all. 2013 Griffin Prize, you're a finalist?
Yes, thank you.
How much you win?
It's public knowledge, $10,000.
I'm going to say it. You won as much money for losing the Griffin as Pulitzer Prize winners get for winning the Pulitzer. That's not bad at all.
Thank you.
Congratulations, and thanks again for coming into TVO tonight.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.